The hero's journey is to become legend.
During the introduction to this review series, I made the comment that I think 2016 was one of the best years, if not the best year, Guild Wars 2 has ever had. That's despite the fact that the Heart of Thorns expansion at release genuinely disappointed me in several places. So how can that be? Well, it's because of ArenaNet's post-launch support. The frequency and quantity of patches to have come to the game since the expansion's release has been incredible. It's a trend that has continued very strong into 2017 too, and that's what I want to talk about today. Or rather, the snag in the road before we got to that. What's crazy is when I look back and I remember we actually had a huge chunk of last year, 2016, where we had nothing at all in the infamous Content Drought. That seems as good a place as any to start. The story begins shortly before Heart of Thorns was even released. One of the bigger problems born from the creation of this expansion, as I already alluded to, was that in order to produce it, ArenaNet had to cancel their ongoing living world developments and instead leave the community with very little to do for several months before the expansion came out. This alone could potentially have severely crippled the active user base. World vs. World by that point in the game's life was in decline. PvP had never really had the systems it truly needed, and it wasn't played by too many people. PvE lacked the kind of endgame progression most MMO players were looking for. If you weren't into making legendary weapons, there really wasn't much to do in those early months before the expansion. So we had a content drought. This drought was punctuated with two large patches. First was the introduction of the new specialization system and Lion's Arch, a redesign of one of the established capital cities in the game. And the second was a hastily implemented mini-event where the Mordrem expansion creatures invaded vanilla maps, which was received incredibly poorly. But aside from those only two things, the community was mostly in the dark and had little to do for many months. It became known as the Content Drought. Despite this, looking back, I'd actually say Guild Wars 2 was doing fairly well for itself, and the reason was the hype for Heart of Thorns. There was continuous, well-spaced news and incremental information about the expansion coming out, lore details, feature details, official live streams, convention presence, and betas. It kept everyone hyped, and so people were happy to play a lot of the game just in preparation of this big thing on the horizon. The pre-HOT content drought was maybe not so bad. But then came another one. As I explained in the previous video, there were probably a lot of misaligned expectations between the developers and the community for this expansion. People wanted more content and less reinventing of the wheel feature stuff, while the expansion was angling for the reverse. But there was a more problematic situation developing beyond even this, and that's the reintroduction of Living World. When Heart of Thorns was coming out, the developers made their game plan very clear. Living World wasn't going away forever just because they were doing expansions now. Living World would be the bridge between expansions, and it would progress the story in the meantime. And I want to say, from the outset, this is a fantastic idea. One of the biggest problems with the vanilla release, way back in 2012, was a lack of updates and meaningful things to do at level 80, because there was no Living World. But that wouldn't be a problem with Heart of Thorns. I remembered excitingly thinking about the expansion releasing, grabbing lots of new and enthusiastic players, and then a month later, Living World could return, and all those players who came for the big release would stick about this time, and for much longer, because now they're hooked into the frequent updates. Well, that didn't happen. Heart of Thorns released, and we had basically nothing. It didn't take them 1 month to get back to Living World, to organise and structure the company and learn how to develop these two things in once, expansions and Living World. It didn't take them 1 month, it took them 9 months. That's right, 3/4 of a year. And that's after the half a year of a drought before Heart of Thorns, and the fact that Heart of Thorns itself didn't have a particularly lengthy story or high quantity of exploration to do. This was the second content drought. It's the main one that everyone talks about, and I think the damage likely speaks for itself. That dream scenario we had imagined hadn't happened at all. The community was in a lurch, and perhaps rightly so. Many of them were used to the Living World Season 1 or 2 formats where we were getting frequent updates. We can only speculate about what happened behind closed doors, but I think it's obvious that in neither 2012 nor in 2015 were ArenaNet prepared to quickly jump into continuous updates after their large releases. It's just a lot of internal structuring and workflow problems to sort out, I guess, and both times ArenaNet's products have suffered. Maybe it's their hesitance to add mandatory and ultra-excessive grind like other MMOs have that also punishes this company, but perhaps that's a discussion for another day. While I can understand a lot of the negativity and likely quitting that occurred during this period of time, there are a few important things I think we should mention about the so-called content drought here today and looking back now that it's all over. And it involves raids.
Mersat prey upon the weak and impressionable, who in turn worship them as gods.
Raids were one of the big new features for Heart of Thorns that I'll be talking about in a later video in much more detail, but for here, they're just important to look at during the content drought. See, after ArenaNet released Heart of Thorns, they revealed that they had split away a very small team of developers who would operate with reasonable autonomy on their own dedicated content apart from everyone else. These were the newly formed Raid developers, and they kicked ass at their job and continue to do so. From this supposedly isolated cell of talent at the company, Guild Wars 2 suddenly had a lot of Raid content coming into the game. There were 3 separate big releases, all of them purely about raiding, and all of them released in the middle of the content drought. What happened to the community with this is pretty interesting and frustrating to look at. See, instead of these genuinely good releases being celebrated and applauded, they were kind of hated on. These were the days where Guild Wars 2 seemed to have sold its soul. See, to the layperson, it just looked like Heart of Thorns had released, adding raiding, a generic elitist MMO feature that many GW2 players of the time weren't even interested in, and then the game had abandoned everything else in favour of only dropping in raid content. To those of us who followed very closely how the company was working and the developer statements, we of course knew that Guild Wars 2 hadn't become a generic raid grinder, but it's hardly difficult to sympathise with people who felt that way. For 3/4 of a year, they felt this way. After all, if it was true that these raids were only being made by a handful of people, how the hell was this handful of people so competent to put out all this content while we saw nothing from the rest of ArenaNet, hundreds of people? If Living World is a priority, where the hell was it? Those are valuable questions to ask. To this day, the community still doesn't know what happened behind those closed doors, but we've mostly moved on from the whole thing as Living World did eventually come back, and it's better than it's ever been before. Perhaps this was never a question of lay people just getting the wrong impression and not listening to developer quotes, and more, maybe, it's a question of whether you believe what the company was saying at all. Maybe it is all a big conspiracy and they did want to become a raid grinder. I'll leave that judgment up to you. But regardless, I always feel a vague sense of disappointment when I think about the content drought. I'm disappointed that Heart of Thorns never retained as many players as it should have. I'm disappointed that good content was coming into the game and genuine hard work from some of the developers somehow became a bad thing. And I'm disappointed that we will forevermore remember this 9-month period as a content drought when, in truth, it did actually have some damn good stuff coming at the time. It just wasn't what all of us expected. Speaking of that stuff that came in the drought, that reminds me, there were at least a few other changes for the non-raiders during that month that we should talk about too. There was a world boss overhaul to the Shatterer, which I did several very excited videos about and never ended up quite as good as I'd hoped for. There was core Tyria gliding, which was an incredibly well received patch. There was a very substantial also expansion 2.0 rebalance. Expansion 2.0 sought to fix a vast number of pain points expressed by the community with Heart of Thorns itself. So Expansion 2.0 wasn't really the content we were looking for, but it did refine the experience of the expansion, and it's important to remember it happened. Challenges were rebalanced to be easier and far more accessible. The XP you get in the jungle areas was straight up doubled. Currencies for the maps and keys started dropping in far higher quantities, giving birth to a community map hopping farm that existed for ages, known as Auric Basin Multi-Loot, and there were many more things of this nature. To be perfectly honest, many of the pain points Expansion 2.0 sought to fix were not pain points I had really felt myself, but I am one of the more dedicated players and it was well received. Despite perhaps some of my disagreements with the Expansion 2.0 changes, there is something very cool that I like to look at. And that's the developers who implemented Expansion 2.0. This was the team of devs who are actually working on the next expansion. They stopped what they were doing for the next big thing that's coming and looked back at Heart of Thorns, and they were the ones responsible for fixing what people felt was kind of shoddy about it. This is really good, and it's an interesting way of doing things, as now we know that the developers in charge of the next expansion have all of the foresight of having to go back and fix what didn't work about the first one. And I think that's something that I can be pretty optimistic knowing about for the future. So that was the content drought. Those were the immediate releases. That was when we were in a bit of a lurch, and at the end of the day, it was a long period of time. But by the middle of 2016, July specifically, Living World Season 3 did finally come back. It's been about another 9 months since then, and in those 9 months, that is when I feel the game has got incredibly good and finally starts living up to my original statements at the start of this video and the last one. That's what we'll get into next time on the review. Let's look at Living World Season 3 itself and the ccrazy shit ArenaNet managed to throw at us. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.